Welcome to the 2022 Flathead Wild and Scenic Rivers webinar. My name is Sheena Pate, and I'm the Watershed Coordinator for Flathead Rivers Alliance. And thrilled to have you here. This is our first webinar series that we have done, and really happy to have you. This is an important topic, and thank you for putting the effort into joining us tonight. So Flathead Rivers Alliance, we were formed in 2019 as a nonprofit, really dedicated to the preservation of the Flathead River system. And our work is focused on the three forks of the Flathead Wild and Scenic River. That would be the North Fork, the South Fork, and the Middle Fork of the Flathead River. This river system flows through the traditional homelands of the Kootenai, the Ktunaxa, the Salish, and the Blackfeet peoples. And Flathead River Alliance is dedicated to three key initiatives: education, stewardship, and community, to support and enhance the stewardship of the outstanding remarkable values of the three forks. This two-part webinar series is here to really help you explore what is a wild and scenic river and comprehensive river management plans. So not only is it important information to know, but it's really kind of setting us up as we're about to enter in the public comment period for the comprehensive river management plan. And tonight, the significance of this webinar is really looking at what is wild and scenic rivers, responsibilities of managing them, and what's around the bend for local initiatives. So some quick housekeeping, as I've seen quite a few more people have hopped on. Please reference the chat box. I will just kind of touch on a couple things. You do have the option for a live transcription of this. There should be a closed caption or a CC somewhere on the bottom of your screen, or their enable transcription. That is available to you only if you enable it. If you have questions throughout the entire presentation, please put them in the chat box. When we get to the Q&A section at the very end, I will be referencing those and sharing them with our panelists so that they can get those answered. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our three panelists that we have today. We have Jessie Stevenson from Northern Rockies. She's a Northern Rockies associate with American Rivers, so we're pleased to have her. Coulter Pence, she's with Flathead National Forest, and she is the Wilderness, Wild and Scenic Rivers and Trail Program Manager at Flathead National Forest, Hungry Horse Glacier View Ranger District. And then Kevin Colburn from American Whitewater, and he's the National Stewardship Director. So all three of these individuals, they are wild and scenic river advocates first, and then we do have a wild and scenic river manager, which is Coulter. So they really add a lot to the storytelling when it comes to the three forks and just wild and scenic rivers in general. So a lot of history, a lot of experience in this realm. So the format of this webinar is we will hop into the presentations. Jessie, Coulter, and then Kevin will follow each other, and then we will wrap up with a Q&A. We'll try to set aside 15 minutes for that, so we'll do the best that we can. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Jessie, and she will take over from here.
Great, thanks Sheena, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I'm going to kick us off by giving an overview of what the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is. We can go ahead and move to that slide, and how it came to be. And I just want to note that I am going to be using the name, the Flathead River, and want to acknowledge and also emphasize that while I'll be using that name tonight, these rivers and the surrounding landscapes have been and still are known by many names, and that this is just one of the many stories that are rooted there. So let's start out with the story of how the idea for the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was actually born. We can move to that slide. The story begins right here in Northwest Montana in the 1950s. And I think we can advance, there we go. Some of you might recognize these two characters as, oh, back one slide, as Doctors John and Frank Craighead, who were brothers and well-known wildlife biologists. The brothers were originally from Washington, D.C., but they ventured out west to conduct grizzly bear research, mostly in the Yellowstone National Park ecosystem, before eventually making their way to the southern crown of the continent and the landscapes around the Three Forks of the Flathead that many of us know so well. They became particularly well known for developing and utilizing radio collars to track grizzlies, like the one that you can see here in this photo, which meant that they not only got to know the landscapes and rivers of this area really well, but they also had a unique window into how the landscapes and particularly how the rivers support and are absolutely vital to the survival of species like grizzlies and others in this area. And I could easily talk about all of the amazing research that the Craigheads did for 10 minutes, but let's fast forward a little bit to the late 1950s. So at this point, we've entered America's dam building era, and the Army Corps of Engineers rolled out a proposal to dam the Middle Fork of the Flathead near Spruce Park in the interest of water storage, flood mitigation, and power generation. The map you can see on the screen right now was created by Brett Leon for a story map that we produced at American Rivers. I believe the link to that is going to be placed in the chat if anyone's interested. Which took a look at 6 dams that were proposed around the state and dove into the stories of why they were never built. And as you can see from this map, the proposed dam would have inundated around 2,100 acres in the Spruce Park area, which was prime habitat for both the grizzlies that the Craigheads had been studying, as well as numerous other species. Shockingly, the proposal also included plans to drill a tunnel through the Flathead Range to deliver water from Spruce Park to Hungry Horse Reservoir, which is a little known fact. And that tunnel would have effectively helped to dewater the Middle Fork of the Flathead entirely. Looking at this map, you can see how large and long that tunnel would have had to be to actually transfer water from one reservoir to the next. So let's turn back to the Craighead brothers now. By the time John and Frank had gotten to know and love this area surrounding the Three Forks of the Flathead, and they had really started to understand how important river ecosystems are. So after the Spruce Park Dam was proposed, the brothers decided to embark on one of the first recorded multi-day trips down the Middle Fork, specifically to get a firsthand look at the proposed dam site and the area that would be flooded if it were built. A lot of folks now point to this trip as maybe the first spark of inspiration, really the first spark of necessity for the creation of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act eventually. Following that trip in June of 1957, John published a feature article titled Wild River in the Montana Wildlife publication, which urged decision makers and the public to take a closer look at what would be lost if rivers like the Middle Fork and others were to be dammed, which is where the quote on this slide is from. And over the next decades, the Craigheads really became advocates for the creation of a federal system that would protect rivers against dams like Spruce Park and other types of harmful development into the future. They knew around the same time that the Wilderness Act was being developed, and they also knew that the Wilderness Act would at least initially focus more predominantly on those higher rock and ice landscapes and a little less on river corridors, which are the ecosystems that wildlife species tend to rely most heavily on. So ultimately, the passage of the Wilderness Act in 1964 really helped to emphasize the need to build a tool that would also protect those river corridors and the species that depend on them. And after over a decade of work in 1968, their efforts paid off with the passage of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So next time you're out on one of the Three Forks of the Flathead or in any of those surrounding landscapes, remember that while the Three Forks weren't actually designated until 1976, they will always be the birthplace of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which is incredibly special. So let's dive into a brief overview of the act itself. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on October 2nd, 1968. And its main purpose is really to protect and enhance rivers in a free-flowing condition that possess one or more outstandingly remarkable values, which you'll most often hear referred to as ORVs, and which I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide. The act specifically protects designated rivers and streams against the construction of dams, like the Spruce Park Dam that was proposed, diversions, and other types of harmful development. But it still allows for land and water resource uses as long as they don't impede the river's free-flowing condition or degrade its water quality or threaten any of the ORVs for which it's designated. Rivers are most commonly designated by Congress, but in some circumstances can also be designated by the Secretary of the Interior and are administered by federal or state agencies, which Coulter is going to dive into a little deeper in the next section. Currently, only 0.25% of rivers in the United States are protected under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which is an incredibly small fraction of the number of incredible wild rivers that are out there. Let's take a look next at what qualities a wild and scenic river might have. So as I mentioned previously, a river must be free flowing to be designated. And this basically means that it's free of dams, diversions, or other types of significant impoundments that might affect its flow. The river stream must also possess one or more of those outstandingly remarkable values, which are things that are unique to or special about that river within a specific region of comparison. Depending on the ORV, that region of comparison might be a large area that covers multiple ecoregions, or it might be something more specific and localized. The most common ORVs we see are the ones that I've listed here, which include botany. So that might be an old growth stand of forest or a rare species of plant. Culture, so places of cultural significance to local tribal nations and indigenous peoples. Climate refugia, which is a newer ORV that we're hearing more and more recently, that essentially means a river or stream which is predicted to provide a cold water refuge for temperature sensitive species as water temperatures rise into the future. From there, fisheries, particularly for sensitive fish species. Geology, that might be a significant waterfall or a unique mineral deposit of some sort. History, recreation, scenery, wildlife, maybe a native or endemic species that relies on the river corridor. And then there are others which are a lot less common. There might be an archaeology ORV or even a literary value on some rivers. Essentially anything that's unique to that river or stream and outstanding within that region of comparison. Next, let's take a quick look at wild and scenic river classifications. So this part can get a little bit confusing given the name wild and scenic, but I hope this slide helps to break it down a little bit. In short, wild and scenic rivers can be classified as either wild, scenic, or recreational. And it's important to remember that the same river can be classified differently depending on the specific section. So for example, the South Fork of the Flathead is designated as wild from its origin to its confluence with the Spotted Bear River, and then is recreational from the Spotted Bear River down to the Hungry Horse Reservoir. As shown in this slide, the main differences between those classifications are how accessible a river stream is, and then whether or not there's development along the shoreline. Luckily, the Three Forks of the Flathead contain all three classifications, so they're really great examples of what those might look like. Rivers classified as wild are free of impoundments, they're inaccessible except by trail, and they have primitive and undeveloped shorelines. So think about the South Fork of the Flathead deep in the Bob Marshall Wilderness and what that looks like. Rivers classified as scenic are also free of impoundments, but they may be accessible by road in some places. And they also have largely primitive and undeveloped shorelines. So think of the North Fork of the Flathead from the Canadian border to just past its confluence with Camas Creek. Lastly, rivers classified as recreational might have had past impoundments or diversions that no longer affect the flow of the river. And they're often readily accessible by road and or railroad. They might also have some shoreline development. So think the middle fork of the Flathead from Bear Creek downstream along Highway 2, where there's the highway right there and then more development along that corridor. All right, I'm going to hand it off to Coulter, who's going to take a deeper dive into what the management of wild and scenic rivers, particularly the Three Forks of the Flathead, looks like.
Okay, thanks, Jesse. Jesse set us up here to sort of take what she shared about the theory of wild and scenic rivers and then see how that shows up on the Three Forks of the Flathead. So what you see on this slide here, trying to unpack a little more the different classifications of the rivers, wild, scenic, and recreational. Let's take a look at how that looks on the Three Forks. So you'll see the map there on the left-hand side, and you see in the pink in that upper left corner, that's the scenic stretch of the upper North Fork, border to Camas. And remember, she shared that these are sections where there may be a road intermittently, not a lot of development, it's limited. That's the upper North Fork of the Flathead. If you look towards the middle of the map, towards the right, you see two green segments there. Those are the wild sections of the Three Forks. One is the upper South Fork, which is mostly within the Bob Marshall Wilderness, although if you look closely, you'll see there's actually a stretch of wild river outside of wilderness. And that's because there's no road, it's only accessible by trail, and there's no development there. So even though it may not be in wilderness, it's still classified as wild. And also you'll see the upper Middle Fork there too in green. And there's actually a tiny little piece of the upper Middle Fork that's actually outside of wilderness, but before it gets to Bear Creek, about a mile or so. So another little tiny piece of wild river outside of wilderness. And then you see two yellow stretches there. That's the lower Middle Fork and the lower North Fork, where there's certainly roads all along the river, and in the lower Middle Fork's case, a railroad, and certainly lots of development or more development in those areas there. So that's how those classifications show up for the Three Forks of the Flathead. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And I shared with you those classifications. You see the table at the top here shows how that mileage breaks out, whether by fork or by classification. There's a total of 219 miles in the Three Forks of the Flathead system. And then you can see that in total, 97.9 of it, so we'll say 98, or not percent, miles, 98 miles roughly is wild, 40.7 are scenic, and then 80 and a half miles or so are recreational. And of course, the Middle Fork is the longest of the Three Forks at 100 miles there. So you can see how that mileage breaks out between classification and fork. And Jesse mentioned that a river corridor is a concept, is a part of a wild and scenic river, and a corridor is approximately a quarter mile on each side of the river. Well, when you add up all of that little strips, all those strips of quarter mile on both sides of the river, that adds up to acreage, right? So in total across the Three Forks, there's 35,000 acres of land in the National Forest, in Flathead National Forest, that are within the Wild and Scenic River Corridor. So that's 35,000 acres that are in the corridor. Glacier National Park, of course, they have a piece of the pie. They have about a little less than 12,000 acres within the corridor. And then you can see below that, there's 9,700 acres private land, and then some representation with state of Montana land, DNRC land in the river corridor. In total, that's 57,000 acres of that quarter mile strip on both sides of the river in total. So the box below that just pointing out that of the 219 miles, 119 is either within wilderness, that being the Great Bear and the Bob Marshall Wilderness, or directly adjacent to Glacier National Park. And 85% of the miles is in federal ownership. So a good chunk of this is being stewarded and is owned by or is managed by the Forest Service in the national park. I've also put a reminder on there for everybody that the boundary between the Flathead National Forest and Glacier National Park is somewhat defined by the river. For the Middle Fork, the boundary between the Flathead Forest and Glacier National Park is the high water mark on the park side, which is river right. The North Fork is different. It's the center of the deepest, most active channel. And that's not those boundaries. Those were actually not addressed in the Wild and Scenic Rivers designation. Those boundaries are actually established when the Glacier National Park was created in 1910. Back in 1910, that's how they defined the park compared to the forest. And then last point here is Flathead National Forest is the lead management agency. We do hold the preponderance of the miles, acreage, et cetera, and of course, all of the South Fork. And so we're the lead agency in terms of administering the river system, and we work closely with Glacier National Park. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Jesse talked about outstandingly remarkable values and how these are things that are outstandingly remarkable. They're unique, they're rare and in extraordinary condition. These are things that make these rivers very special and worth protecting for perpetuity. It's important to have those defined so that we can keep our eye on protecting and enhancing those going forward, which is one of the mandates in the law. So what you see here is the outstandingly remarkable values for the Three Forks, where the X's are corresponds to where that ORV is present. So I'll just point out a few things here. Of course, fisheries is an outstandingly remarkable value in all Three Forks. Whereas botany, it's not we don't have an outstandingly remarkable value around botany in all sections, but in some sections for sure. It's no surprise there is a lot of ORVs present in the Three Forks system because it is an outstandingly remarkable river system. And I think here when we get to the Q&A session, I'm going to try to share a link that if you want to learn more about those ORVs, you can do a little reading about that. Let's go ahead and go ahead to the next slide. Just wanted to share here who are the river managers. A few pictures here, but on the Forest Service side, there's staff at the Hungry Horse Ranger Station. There's staff at the Spotted Bear Ranger Station. We have river managers, river rangers. We're doing our best to even ramp up with staffing. This summer, we're expecting to have up to 5.5 actually river rangers. How do we have a half of a river ranger? Well, we'll be sharing one with Flathead Rivers Alliance is how that's going to work. And at Spotted Bear, I believe they're anticipating having 4 working on the river this summer. And Glacier National Park, of course, they have a lead river contact, and they anticipate having 2 river rangers working for them. And other key partners is Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, of course. That is both wardens, fisheries biologists, et cetera. And now Flathead Rivers Alliance river ambassadors will be key stewards and partners working with our Three Forks of the Flathead River system. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I want to share with you a few of the management things going on in the things that we're working on as we manage the river system. We're doing some water quality monitoring. So I'm going to share with you several slides here about things that we do to manage the river system, and this is one of them. So water quality monitoring. Between the park and the forest, we've been doing some water quality monitoring. What you see on the graph there, or on the chart there, is E. coli. We've been sampling for E. coli. Reminder, E. coli is a bacteria that can live in the gut of any mammal, not just humans, but any mammal. And we've been sampling for E. coli, and you can see what's shown up. The limit for the Clean Water Act is they don't want to see any more than 32. I think it's like I don't remember specifically what MPN stands for in this moment, but as you can see, what we found is we're very, very below that upper limit. We've also started water quality monitoring with adventure scientists. That's actually a nationwide program, and citizen science can sign up for that. If you want to explore that, I encourage you to Google adventure scientists and look into their Wild and Scenic River water quality program. And we've been gathering temperature, turbidity, dissolved oxygen, salinity, things like that, and turning that in. And in a few years, the report's going to be generated to share back out on those results. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Another thing here that involves managing a wild and scenic river that's not well known is that we permit river research, and we're very thoughtful in the work that we do with that. So here's 2 interesting things that's been going on with river research. In the lower Middle Fork, the Smithsonian Institute has a permit to explore a fossil site there. And it is fascinating what they're discovering there. They've discovered new types of parasitic wasps in the fossil record there. So never known to science, new types of fossils and new types of, these little bugs and critters. And some of them are very high quality as well. They've been able to extract hemoglobin from some of those fossil records. So we're talking Jurassic Park. I saw the advertisement on TV this last weekend for the new Jurassic Park movie. I'm a fan of Jurassic Park, actually, so I'm looking forward to that. Anyways, and what they're learning about through those fossils is what the climate looked like back in the eons ago for this area, and it's actually causing them to rethink what the climate was eons ago from what they assumed. They're realizing it was maybe not quite what they thought it was. Another piece of research that's recently come out is around stoneflies that are alive today, not in the fossil record. And some of that research is that they're identifying a new species of stonefly specific to this area, and are also starting to understand how those stoneflies can live in extreme environments and how they fit into the food web. It's really interesting stuff. We're very thoughtful when we authorize river research like that, and I'm pleased to share that with you because it's important to other people learn, but get the benefit of what's gathered by the scientists. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Another thing to know about wild and scenic rivers is that vegetation management can occur in the river corridor, so that quarter-mile on each side thing there. Of course, it must be consistent with the classification of the river. So a wild river where there are no roads, it's probably not possible to do a lot of vegetation management there. But in a recreational or a scenic section of river, it is possible. It's got to be consistent with the classification. And of course, we're using best management practices to protect water quality when those projects are considered. And I want to give you some examples that have occurred in the recent history on the Three Forks. So on the North Fork, around Big Creek Campground and Glacier Institute, if you've noticed, there's been some pre-commercial thinning there. That is intended to create a hazardous fuel buffer around the campground, around Glacier Institute, and that's occurred within the river corridor there. There's also on the Middle Fork around Essex, we've had commercial harvest occurring there for fuels reduction purposes around the private property, et cetera. And then one last example on the South Fork around Spotted Bear Campground, the big flats there, we've done prescribed fire for vegetation management purposes. So just some examples of what can occur in a river corridor around vegetation management. Let's go to the next slide. Another aspect of managing wild and scenic rivers is conservation easements and acquisitions. So I want to remind everybody that wild and scenic river regulations, rules of thumb, they do not apply to private lands, they apply to federal lands within the river corridor. But the Forest Service, the Park Service, we can acquire conservation easements or just outright purchase land from a willing seller. So to date, there's been about 5,200 acres and 62 easements that have been secured in the Upper North Fork and the Lower Middle Fork. There's some large tracts there, Rocky Barrow Ranch, Kintla Ranch, Nyack Flats. Those were the large tracts acquired. But also Wirt's Cabin, Ben Rover, Schnauz Cabin, of course, very popular rental cabins. Those are in the river corridor and they were acquired by the Forest Service from willing sellers. Of note, also West Glacier River access site, that was private property. Can you imagine the Lower Middle Fork without access at West Glacier? Those were acquired years ago and helped provide public access to the river system. And last, we actually have a recent one. There's a little parcel between Polebridge and Ben Rover Cabin that the Forest Service acquired last year to help keep those lands undeveloped and keep them accessible. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Recreation management, we could do a whole evening on this topic, but I want to just kind of point out some of the highlights around things that go on within recreation management. Of course, maintaining access sites. We have lots of access sites. and sort of like the daily management, if you will, cleaning them routinely, making sure the signs are up, things like that. But I also want to share that Great America Outdoors Act funding has come through, and we are working on planning some bigger remodel or some deferred maintenance, if you will, trying to take care of the long overdue type of stuff at those access sites. So I expect we'll have new bulletin boards as an example, kind of moving on from the older out of date ones, and upgraded nicer bulletin boards is one example around the work that we do to maintain river access sites. We monitor use levels and trends. The river rangers, when they're out patrolling, are always keeping track of the number of people, the types of craft, where we see people, and we do crunch those numbers and look at those and use that to inform management decisions. We also administer river outfitter and guide permits. If you have a commercial enterprise on the national forest, you need to have an outfitter and guide permit, and we manage those. And the fees we collect from outfitter and guide permits, that is returned to the forest, and we use that money in the river program to maintain river access sites, to continue our work. We don't receive much money otherwise to do that. The money that we use in the river system is actually coming from outfitter and guide fees. Another aspect of recreation management is, working with the regulations that we have. Some of those are around food storage, of course, in grizzly bear country, fishing, camping, some of those regulations. Two more things I want to highlight for you around recreation management is that the river rangers, once they get going in the summer, we share our river patrol reports. So float times, observations of what the rapids are looking like, things like that. We share that on the Flathead National Forest's website. If you haven't checked that out, plan to follow up once the season really gets going. You can see what the timing and things looked like when we were there for the Lower Middle Fork and North Fork. And last one is our Three Forks, the Flathead Float Guide. We've created that a number of years ago. We revise it every few years, and that's available for people to use. And anytime somebody calls me up and wants to plan a trip, I say, well, do you have a map in hand? Do you have a Three Forks float guide in hand right now? And because we're not going to do a lot of planning until you have that map in hand. All right, let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. Oh, I just wanted to kind of show a sort of range of things that go on. Again, our focus here is around fundamentals of wild and scenic rivers. So just a few snapshots of work that we do to manage the Three Forks of the Flathead. So a photo there of, we do manager float trips between the park and with partners, Flathead, but the park and the forest, inviting fish, wildlife, and parks, other key stakeholders. We did a really great one with Flathead Rivers Alliance this last summer. Safety size up. I just like to show this photo because it's in the Upper Middle Fork. It's not a common place for people to see. And this is at Tommy's Rock. And as you can see, there's a good amount of debris right there at that particular location. We do campsite inventories. We do interagency river training where we're cross-training our river rangers, et cetera. And last one is keeping those outhouses clean as best as we can. Always keeping after it. So with that, I want to turn it over to Kevin. He's going to talk a little bit more about what's around the bend, what's coming around the corner with Wild and Scenic Rivers.
I just noticed the Q&A, so you guys can answer some questions. That's good. Yeah, so the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was supposed to provide a check and balance to the dam building push in the country. We have 80,000 dams, 90,000 dams that are significant, and we have a couple hundred wild and scenic rivers. We've only 5 in Montana, so I don't think we're quite there yet. So I'm going to talk about those of us that are trying to grow the system. And we're going to talk about 2 kinds of wild and scenic protections. One is administrative, so by the agencies, and the other is congressional. So in the Act, it tells the agencies to consider potential wild and scenic rivers in their planning. And that has been transferred down through the agencies. And now what they do is every time they do a planning process, so a new forest plan, a new BLM plan, they have to assess the rivers on their forest. And the rivers that are free flowing and have at least one ORV, those outstandingly remarkable values, is considered eligible. And those rivers get interim protection for the life of that plan. And it's pretty good. It basically tells the agency that whatever makes that river special, they have to protect so that if Congress wants to designate it in the future, it'll still be worth it. And that makes sense, right? Because in the 60s, dams were happening fast. There weren't a lot of rivers left. And I think Congress knew that the people that wanted to do things to rivers that were incompatible with wild and scenic could move faster than Congress could. Still the case. Can we go to the next slide? So across the region, these forest plans come up every 15 to 20 years to 30 years, depending on how long it takes them to do them. BLM too. And we've been working on this, lots of Montanans. I'm sure that almost everyone on this call has probably at some point, sent a letter to the Forest Service about a river, hopefully. If not, you should. So on the Kootenai National Forest, we worked on that 10 years ago, maybe. And basically bringing evidence of values to the Forest Service. We got to get those ORVs documented and in a compelling way, because it's a pretty subjective analysis. So we want to like wow the agency and have folks like Coulter say, wow, they're right. That is an awesome river, So, and on the Flathead, it worked. We almost doubled the number of eligible streams between the old forest plan and the new one, and the number, and they're all awesome. Some of the most beautiful rivers in the whole country, in my opinion. Same with Helena, Lewis, and Clark, almost tripled. And the Custer Gallatin just came out weeks ago with a significant increase. Next up, the Nez Perce Clearwater over in Idaho should release their plan in the summer. It's past the public comment period on that one. There's about 800 miles of potential eligible streams in that plan that may or may not make it to paper. So we'll see. And then for you all, the Lolo and Bitterroot National Forests are going to do planning next in your area, and the Lolo will probably go first. That's what we're hearing. So it's a great opportunity. Plan some hikes, take good photos, take video, be ready to tell good stories about what makes rivers in the Lolo and Bitterroot National Forest rare, unique, or exemplary. And then also BLM does the same thing. Keep an eye on the Missoula district. I think that's kind of wrapping up. And then the Dillon area as well. So next slide. Oh yeah, so eligibility is good, but designation is great. And people often ask me, sometimes opponents of wild and scenic will say, it's already protected as eligible, why designate it? And the answer is the same reason why when you're engaged, you get married. You don't tell your fiance, we don't need to get married, we're already engaged. It's the same thing, it's not the same thing. Marriage and designation, it's an honor, it's a bringing together a community, it's a commitment, it's about perpetuity, and it's about peace of mind. Designation is important, it's different than eligibility. So a bunch of years ago, 10, 11 maybe, a group of us got together and formed Montanans for Healthy Rivers to try to grow the wild and scenic river system in the state. We started really broad, just saying which rivers matter to people, what are you worried about, what tools do you know about that could help these rivers. We did hundreds of workshops. We were in Condon, we were in Whitefish, we were in Kalispell, everywhere. And we got this great kind of Western Montana wild and scenic bill that emerged from it. We can go to the next slide. And then someone proposed a dam on East Rosebud Creek, and that springboarded East Rosebud forward of the rest of our campaign. And it kind of became a proof of concept for us. Like with all this local support for wild and scenic on East Rosebud, can we pass the first wild and scenic bill since the 70s? Yes, we can. And we did in 2018. It was awesome. This is my kid. We happened to be driving through Billings and saw the paper and she was stoked. So anyway, so we passed East Rosebud 2018, and then we go to the next slide. And we took our big package, we were all excited, and we went to DC, and everyone we talked to said it's too big. So we split the package in half, still too big, we don't care, we want to do it anyway. So we split it in half. And the first piece to move forward is the Montana Headwaters Legacy Act. You can go to the next slide. That legislation is located just north of Yellowstone. It's 20 rivers, 385 miles. It's been introduced twice, so it's on its really like first full Congress and hasn't had a hearing yet. If you would like to support this, please call your senators or congresspeople and tell them you love the Montana Headwaters Legacy Act. You can learn more on our website. It's healthyriversmt.org. And this will be in good company, but it will, I think, just about exactly double the wild and scenic mileage in Montana. Next slide. But we didn't forget about the other half of our campaign either, which is your neck of the woods. This is, and you can put in chat, who knows where this river is? It's not quite your neck of the woods, but it's close. Anyway, we still have so much work and so many conversations that we've had, and there's so much support for rivers in the Flathead and rivers in your area for designation. And it wasn't a prioritization to start north of Yellowstone. It was just kind of what we had to do. We don't want that enthusiasm to go away. We want people to stay excited, stay informed, stay engaged, talk about it. You can go to the next slide. Anybody guess? Yeah, Dearborn. Oh, Scott Bozzy, you're cheating. Nope, Bill, you're wrong. Anyway, it is in fact the Dearborn. Hike up, it's right by Devil's Glen. So this is what the proposal that came out around the crown of the continent looks like. It looks very similar to our eligible streams. Flathead Tribs plus North Fork Blackfoot, Montour Creek, Dearborn, Rock Creek, a couple Swan Tribs, part of the Swan. Amazing. So please try to help us stay engaged with this process. Like, you know, follow us on healthyriversmt.org. And it never hurts to like write LTEs and talk to your county commissioners and talk to people that you know, and just keep asking for wild and scenic rivers in this part of the world. Next slide. And let's see. So the last thing I'll say is that this was my summer vacation. It was so amazing. I love the Flathead. The future is bright for wild and scenic rivers in Montana and nationwide. There's 6,400 rivers or so, or miles of rivers in Congress right now waiting to be designated. And pardon the pun, that's kind of the high watermark for the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Like, we've never had that many rivers in Congress waiting to be passed, and some of them are going to go. It's an exciting time. It came out of the 2018 50th anniversary of the act. There's all this enthusiasm, a lot of great bills. We're in the mix with Montana Headwaters Legacy Act. There's tons of support. We've got the current bill is from Senator Tester. We'd love Senator Daines to join. East Rosebud was full delegation, bipartisan. That's how we want to roll. So it's exciting. And then I also just want to mention that there's another kind of exciting thing that's happening is tribal engagement in both wild and scenic, but also the cultural waterways ordinance from the tribe there on the Flathead is just really amazing. And also a great model that we think is just has a bright future as well. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate everyone sharing their knowledge and spectacular photos from the Three Forks as well. So what we're going to do
Is we have some excellent questions that you have been dropping in the question and answer form, and then I've also seen some in the chat as well. What I'm going to do is kind of hop between both of those and try to get as many as we can answered that we can for this specific webinar. I am taking notes on additional ones that we can come back and help answer in other formats as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pose a couple of the questions to the panelists, and as they're answering, I'm going to drop some resource links into the chat box that you can reference at a later date. We'll also provide that in a follow-up email. So once again, thank you so much, panelists, for sharing with this group. So there was a question about when you say river corridor is a quarter mile on each side, is that from the center of the river, or is that from the high water mark?
Okay, I'll try to tackle that one here and initially, and then Jesse, Kevin, add on if you think I've missed something here. And actually, we have a second question about the river corridor, whether it's been mapped. So actually, I think I'll try to tackle both of those at the same time because they're related. River corridor generally is 1 quarter mile on each side of the river. When it was designated and that's also a generality. And I'll unpack that generality. I'll unpack that in a second here. But in the Three Forks of the Float guide, I just ran and grabbed mine off my bookshelf. We do show the corridor in the map in the Three Forks guide there. It's also on any forest, Flathead National Forest map if you look closely there. And in the float guide, it's a dashed brown line. Anyways, and it's where I'm saying it's this generality is like for the North Fork, for example, where there's private property. The corridor does not include the private property, so it snaps a little bit. Not to include the private property. And so it's a little jagged, if that makes sense. So look closely at your Three Forks of the Float guide map, and you'll see for the North Fork on River Right, which is a mix of national forest and private property, you'll sort of see a rough 1/4 mile outline, but it sort of snaps to private or to property lines, whereas on the park side where there is not private property, it follows more clearly the contours of the river. So yes, the river corridor is mapped and you can see that. And the question about it being from the center or from the high water mark, it was from the center when the river was designated. So, the river's migrated in some cases. And so it's not, we would need to remap that to have it be, back on point with that goal of 1/4 mile. That's not done frequently. So it's an approximation of, it's roughly 1/4 on each side there. So I hope I tried to answer 2 questions at once there. And I'll take a moment here and then turn it over to the colleagues here. We provided a few links for you in the chat, and I wanted to point to a couple of those. The first link there is our intention tonight was to talk about fundamentals of wild and scenic rivers. But I did want to point out, if you're wanting to get more information on comprehensive river management plan, we put the link for you to go to the Forest Service's website about that. So if you want to follow that link to go do your background reading on comprehensive river management plan. The second link there is rivers.gov, www.rivers.gov. If you want to learn more about wild and scenic rivers, some guidance documents that a person like myself reads to get direction on different things around managing rivers, check out rivers.gov. It's very useful. And the third link there is a story map that is about the National Wild and Scenic River System. So you can learn about wild and scenic rivers, the extent of them across the country, and see some other examples besides the Flathead system. So with that, I'm going to close. And I know Jessie also provided an excellent link for a project she's worked on, and I want to give her a chance to talk about that in the link that's been provided for that in the chat as well.
Thanks, Coulter. Sure, I'll touch on that just really quickly. So there is a link in the chat to another story map called Montana's Legacy of River Protection Story Map. It's one that I produced last year with American Rivers. And it looks at the stories of 6 dams that were proposed throughout Montana, and really dives into the stories of why they weren't built and how things could have been affected if they were. So if you all remember the map that I showed of what the Spruce Park Dam reservoir would have looked like, that's from that story map. There are maps like that for each of them, which is, I think, one of the most compelling parts of the story map. You can actually see what the reservoirs would have looked like had those dams been built, and then hear from some of the local voices and learn about some of the species that would have been affected and such. So feel free to go take a look at that. The link is in the chat.
Jessie, it looks like there is a question in the chat that maybe you could share a little bit more information about if you have a question about, you had mentioned climate refugia is a newer ORV. Can you explain how those are added to the list of considerations?
Sure, great question. And Coulter and Kevin, feel free to follow up. So there is not an official list of outstandingly remarkable values, but there is a list of the most common outstandingly remarkable values that we tend to see. So there's not an official process by which any value has to be added to the list. The most common ones we tend to see, again, especially in this region, are fisheries values, recreation values, scenic values, wildlife, cultural values, and so on. The climate refugia ORV specifically, we've seen more recently simply because there's been more research done on which rivers and streams might provide cold water refuges into the future. I can also share a link in the chat, or share a link with Sheena to share in the chat, that will direct you to the Climate Shield Cold Water Refuge research, which was done by the Rocky Mountain Research Station and is housed on a Forest Service website, or an fs.fed.us website. It's really interesting research that's been done. They have an interactive map that you can look at. You can select different temperature sensitive species of fish to take a look at, and it will map the rivers and streams that are predicted to provide cold water refuge in 2040. So you can see which rivers and streams are predicted to provide refuge for various species. So that's a great question. To recap, there is no specific, no official process by which an ORV has to be added. It simply has to be something that is unique to that river or stream within the region of comparison. And as I mentioned, sometimes there are really unique, outstanding and remarkable values, such as literary values, maybe a river or stream that had significance in literature and is therefore seen as outstanding. Great question.
We have time for just a couple more. I think we could probably throw this one to Kevin if he wanted. A question about how wild, scenic, and recreational rivers are distinct or not from national rivers. So wild and scenic river, is there a difference from national designated rivers?
Not sure exactly what national rivers would be. Is anyone else familiar with that designation? They're all national wild and scenic rivers. It's incredibly confusing that they made wild, scenic, and recreational all wild and scenic rivers. It's a brilliant piece of legislation, except for that. I wish I'd picked different words. Does anybody else know?
I'm wondering if maybe a scenic waterway or a designated waterway. I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
Like boundary water. I don't. If that was one of your questions, you can feel free to drop some more clarification in there.
I'll follow up with that though. I too, I'd like a little more information to try to be able to answer the question. But Kevin brings up something that's a common confusion, and that is the names: wild, scenic, recreational. It's a great concept. Sometimes I wish they just use different names. And Jesse did a great job of covering it. I want to just reinforce a scenic river. Nothing in that definition said that it is scenic, beautiful. Certainly, our scenic river here, the Upper North Fork, is very scenic, but it's actually about the amount of development there, which is that sort of middle ground, not highly developed. And then recreational rivers, hopefully they do have good recreation, but nothing in that definition said that they inherently had high degrees of recreation value. In our case, ours do. The lower Middle Fork, lower North Fork definitely have a high degree of recreational value, but that recreational definition was about having a higher presence of road and higher presence of development and even railroads. So with that, I'm going to segue. I see there's another question here about essentially what is the classification and what is the below Blankenship? What is it, is that North Fork or Middle Fork? Yeah, so here's another confusing thing, and I'll try to be quick, we're almost out of time. That is classified as recreational, and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act defined the Middle Fork from its headwaters to the confluence with the South Fork. So from Blankenship down to the confluence with the South Fork, by Wild and Scenic River definition, is the Middle Fork. USGS, U.S. Geological Service, they consider that actually where Blankenship, where the confluence is, they actually consider that the start of the Flathead system. So yes, it's definitely confusing. But if you care about wild and scenic rivers and the protections that come with them, you want that stretch to be considered wild and scenic is what I would say there. So with that, Sheena, I'll turn it back to you. I know we're about out of time here.
Yeah, I will wrap it up quite quickly. I didn't want to miss, I received some really great questions that were more cultural resource based. So I do want to kind of pose one to y'all. This was from an email received. So how are wild and scenic river systems managed for cultural resources, including sites that are culturally significant to Indigenous peoples? And is there consultation with tribal historic preservation officers?
Well, I can try to get started here. We, on the Three Forks, the cultural aspect, we consider to be an ORV, an outstanding and remarkable value. We call it the ethnographic value, that there are deep cultural and valuable resources. So we acknowledge that that's a part of what makes this river system special. Check out that ORV document. I shared a link about that earlier, unpacks that a little bit. And yes, our heritage specialists, both with the Forest Service and the Park Service, work with the tribes, Salish Kootenai, Blackfeet, et cetera, to if we have a project or something, to connect with them and work out the resources that need to be protected there.
Perfect. Well, there are several more questions. I'll try to capture those and we'll figure out how to get some answers to you. Really appreciate you being here. Just want to do a quick plug. We do have a CRMP 101, so it's the second part in this 2 series, and that is March 30th. We will have representatives from Flathead National Forest and Glacier National Park at that one, so don't miss that one. I do want to do a quick plug. So happy to see some of our river ambassadors on participating in this webinar. It's good to see you. It's been a long winter. I look forward to seeing you on the river. We do have 2 volunteer opportunities coming up. If you would like to learn more about it, we have some volunteer opportunity teasers. They're just 30-minute live Zooms that you can hop on in March. We have a river ambassador training in April and a river recreation monitoring training in April as well. You can find specific dates and times on flatheadrivers.org. There's a couple of one-day cleanup events that I know the community loves coming out for, and that's in June as well. So just keep checking back with our website and those will be posted. But with that, I just want to say thank you so much.